along with Mexicans and Asians, were ignored by the New Deal programs. And as tenant farmers, as farm laborers, as migrants, as domestic workers, people of color did not qualify for unemployment insurance, minimum wages, Social Security, or farm subsidies. Roosevelt was careful not to offend Southern white politicians whose political support he needed, so he didn't push for a bill against lynching. So blacks, Mexicans, Asians, and whites were segregated in the armed forces, and black workers were discriminated against in getting jobs. People who were of color were the last hired and the first fired. So in the 1930s, it was a struggle by people of color to gain admission into both unions as well as larger society, the institutions of larger society. Then there's this one man named A. Philip Randolph. He was the head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, a socialist. He threatened a massive march on Washington in 1941. And only when Roosevelt agreed to sign an executive order establishing a Fair Employment Practices Committee was the march called off. Now, the Fair Employment Practices Committee laid the foundation for the civil rights movement that would emerge a few years later. So let's go to a brief bio on A. Philip Randolph and appreciate his importance to the black community.
I think one of the individuals that in some ways encapsulates as much of the full range of political organizing in Harlem over many decades of the 20th century would be A. Philip Randolph. Here's a man who comes into the fullness of his calling first as a socialist. He is the co-editor of a magazine called The Messenger, advocating for taking down capitalism as really the only true road to racial equality, which eventually leads him to union organizing. And so he founds the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids. The and maids gets dropped off over time, but initially it really was a mass labor movement organized around increasing wages and benefits for black porters and maids on Pullman cars, which traveled all around the country. A. Philip Randolph also is the broker of the March on Washington movement, which is a threat posed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to integrate the defense industries that were taking advantage of black migrants coming out of the South in response to the opportunities of World War II. And so with the threat of 100,000 black people marching on Washington in 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt preemptively signs Executive Order 8802, the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Randolph eventually supports Martin Luther King, the young Baptist preacher in the mid-1950s, and ultimately leads to being the lead planner of the March on Washington in 1963. A. Philip Randolph even lived long enough to witness the influence of Malcolm X on this community. So if you just take A. Philip Randolph, that one life rooted here in this community, in all the different philosophies and ideological approaches that he took in trying to move the needle on civil rights in this country, you get a wonderful sense of the richness of ideas that were in circulation.
All right, so A. Philip Randolph, he's going to finally realize his dream of the March on Washington in 1963. It's going to catapult Martin Luther King into prominence. But again, let's appreciate this generation.